Everyone. Today I have a good plans and good clips from a podcast where the Colonel Douglas MacGregor, who is a retired U.S. Army general, and he described about the how October 7 was happened and if the Netanyahu know everything before the October 7 was happens and now how this will happen and what's the role of regional players like Turkey or UAE and other America, and what's the key role played by the Americans and Russians as well as the Iranians, because the whole things which are going on have a very high influence by the Iranians, because Iran's made a excess of resistance where triple H matlab Hamas, Houthi or Hezbollah, three major military organizations who are involving in this conflict. Houthi are targeting continuously on the vessels of our ships on the Red Sea, and Hezbollah on the northern side of Israel is continuously targeting the military base of Israel. And second is the Hamas, who is a military organization in Gaza, is continuously fighting with Israel. So one thing is come here in my mind, that's how this war is happened and how much times to take the stop this wars, and how much innocent lives is being taken by this Israeli army.
Major global conflict that the United States is certainly at the center of as well.
Well, keep in mind when the Nazi and Soviet states signed a non aggression pact and agreed to effectively partition Poland, with the Soviets taking the lion's share of the East and the Nazis taking most of what was in the West. Everyone said, well, that's impossible. How could that happen? Who saw that coming? Well, anybody who knew the history of the region and Europe knew that Germans and Russians could cooperate, and usually did, on a whole range of topics. So it shouldn't have come as a surprise. But it did. People were shocked. You have the same thing right now in the Middle East. The war between Israel and the Muslim Arabs in the region has never ended. It's been ongoing since the Israeli state was founded. Now, the Israelis have enjoyed an advantage because their human capital came out of Europe, so you had a higher standard of education, more broadly, more technological talent and understanding of how to employ things and do things. That worked for a long time. Subsequently, we began providing them with an enormous infusion of technology, military and otherwise, to help them. So they were able to master the environment, effectively defeat whatever threats were there. At the same time, we had a series of presidents, beginning with Eisenhower and up through Nixon, who were always prepared, and actually I would argue even under George W. Bush, who were always prepared to set limits to what the Israelis could do with their superior military power.
Right.
And essentially saying this far and no further. You know, when I was in Israel, I think this was I don't know if it was 2001, I think it probably was, the Israelis under Sharon made an incursion into Gaza. Mm-hmm. And they were bulldozing some houses. Well, the Israeli generals at the time urged Sharon not to do that, said this isn't going to help our case. Well, not long thereafter, you had George W. Bush on the phone and said, look, Ariel, this is unacceptable. You got to get out of there. This is going to produce more trouble than it's worth, so pull them out. So they did. That's gone completely.
Yeah.
I would say that now Washington is firmly under the control of Israel and its supporters in the United States. Absolutely. Yeah. To the point where support for the Israelis at this stage is effectively unconditional. So that's a big change.
Yeah.
That has to be kept in mind. And I think as a result, Mr. Netanyahu decided that this is a good time to strike at Gaza. The attack from Gaza essentially handed him an opportunity on a silver platter.
Right.
And we're beginning to find out that, yes, it was a terrible attack and terrible things were done, but not quite as it was originally described.
That's right.
40 babies didn't have their heads chopped off. Everyone wasn't raped and so forth. So on. Now we're finding that it was a lot of friendly fire where inexperienced Israeli soldiers opened fire and accidentally killed Israeli citizens. That's a problem when you haven't seen a lot of action for a long time and you've acted largely as a policeman, not as a soldier. But the point is that he said, look, we're never going to get along with these people. Hamas is committed to our destruction, so we'll destroy them.
Right.
And you know from the beginning that you're never going to get all of those Hamas fighters,
Right.
because they're a school of fish swimming in an ocean. So how do you get at the fish that you really want? You drain the ocean. They're draining the ocean in Gaza. They are herding, forcing, pushing, use whatever terminology you want, the population out of Gaza. And they are utterly destroying the infrastructure, the houses and the buildings, making it very clear to the population being driven out, you can't come back. There's nothing to come back to.
Right.
The only thing I can find that is in the modern era that approximates this was the German response to the Warsaw Uprising in 1944 between 1 August and 1 September. And the Germans went into the old city and crushed the opposition and effectively drove the population out. Long columns of thousands of Poles marching out of Warsaw. They killed as many of the opposition as they could, and what was left when it surrendered went to concentration camps, and that was the end of it.
Yeah.
Poland did not recover from that because when the Soviets arrived, they were actually very happy that whatever resistance to their arrival in government had been eliminated for them by the Nazis. But that's as close as I can come. And it worked. The Germans were successful. Now, it didn't do much for Germany. As I said, the principal beneficiaries were the communists. The last 50 years, and unless Hamas and the population is gone, we will never be safe. It's not an unreasonable position to take, except that we live in the 21st century.
Right.
Things can't be concealed.
Yeah,
Things
exactly.
that no one ever saw until the war was over, at least they saw the effects of it, are now visible almost instantaneously.
Right.
The world in the Middle East has changed. In the last 50 years, countries that were much less capable, much less technologically sophisticated are now actually very sophisticated.
Right.
Include Iran, Turkey, even Jordan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates. Everyone can watch, everyone can see, and everyone is enraged. And so the question is that has to be asked of Mr. Netanyahu is, can you kill your way out of this? I think the answer is no. The time to do that has run out as it is. And then you have to ask, well, can Hamas, under any circumstances, ever live in peace with Israel? I think the answer to that is probably not.
Right.
In fact, the answer now is, can the whole region tolerate Israel after what's been happening? After seeing over 12,000 people killed, 4,500 children, on and on and on. We don't know how many fighters have been killed. The Israelis say 1,000 had. How could they possibly know?
Right.
We think the Israelis have sustained pretty heavy casualties. We don't know what that is. No one's releasing that. No one's telling the truth. We didn't tell the truth during World War II about the heavy casualties we were sustaining against the Germans.
Right.
There probably would have been outrage in the United States, and Eisenhower and a lot of generals would have been relieved. But after the war, gradually over many decades, the truth has come out.
Right.
We said we inflicted 200,000 casualties on the Germans during the Battle of the Bulge. The Germans took 68,000 casualties. Only 11,000 killed. We were over 140,000 casualties and 20,000 killed. So, when in doubt, lie. That's the metric in war. And I think right now we have no idea what's really happened to the Israelis or exactly what's happened to the Arabs. But we know, in general terms, this is a catastrophe, a humanitarian disaster and a catastrophe.
Yeah.
So the question is, what's next? And those two questions have to be answered.
Right.
And I don't think you're going to get good answers, which means I don't think this ceasefire is going to produce anything really good. It'll temporarily stop the bleeding.
Yes.
The bleeding will recommence. And then the question is, how far does it spread? And Mr. Putin has now given I think, a very honest and accurate speech about the conditions inside the Middle East and said, you cannot pass resolutions condemning one side and not the other.
Right.
It has to be balanced.
Right.
And the entire region has to become involved, as do the great powers, to stop this. And if this does not happen, we will get a regional conflict that has global ramifications.
Absolutely.
Where we are.
Yeah, I think I mean, it's amazing that they were able to negotiate a temporary ceasefire, but immediately Netanyahu said, "This, of course, is temporary, and we will be continuing the bleeding," as you said. And I think what we've seen, I'm quite worried for Israel in the future. I mean, obviously, Israel is a close ally of the United States. I mean, I think. Israel has certainly a right to exist as a country. I don't think there's any debate around that. But I'm really fearful for Israel in the future. For example, if they continue this and they drive out 2 million people out of Gaza, what is the future really going to be? Because think about all these children that are getting slaughtered. I mean, are they just, creating more extremists, because of the violence that is really happening against these civilians? And, if Israel just drives out 2 million people and just overtakes Gaza, how is that going to be perceived in the Middle East? What is the future here regarding Israel's operation?
You're concerned about Israel, and I obviously have historically supported the Israelis. I would like to see Israel survive as a state.
Yeah.
I'm not unsympathetic to them, but that doesn't mean that I hate Muslim Arabs. I do not hate Muslim Arabs, and I do
Agreed.
not think they should be subjected to what they're experiencing right now.
Agreed.
I don't think collective punishment is a good idea and a workable one.
Yeah.
But I'm not an Israeli, but I am an American. And I think first and foremost about the United States. And I'll be frank with you, I'm very worried about our position in the region and in the world.
Yeah.
Because everyone knows that we ultimately hold all the cards when it comes to Israel.
That's right.
As I said before, previous presidents have intervened and said, that's enough, stop. And sometimes that suited the Israelis and sometimes it did not, but it was in our interest to do so. In 1973, we wanted to avoid not just a regional war, but a war that could involve the Soviet Union at that stage. And we knew that if the Israelis crossed the Suez Canal, which they ultimately did, and actually drove right into Cairo and destabilized the whole country and tried to bring the government down, that the Russians or the Soviets at that point would intervene with military power. So we didn't want to go down that road. And that's why we said, okay, you cross the Suez, pull out, get back on the other side.
Right.
And ultimately, I think that war turned out to be beneficial strategically, ultimately to Egypt and Israel. That's something good that I think is now in very serious jeopardy as a result of current events. But the real issue is this. Mr. Erdogan in Turkey now disposes over an enormous amount of military power.
Right.
It's got good funding and backing from the Emirates, particularly Qatar. Turkey now enjoys a certain amount of support from the Russians. Even the Iranians, who are historically rivals, have privately said, this is too much for us. We are equally disgusted. And in other words, Sunni and Shia will bury the hatchet and we will deal with this problem because we all must become involved.
Right.
Mr. Erdogan has now launched something called the Freedom Flotilla, about 100 vessels carrying humanitarian aid to Gaza. And they've left port, and they're now steaming in the direction of Gaza. It doesn't take very long to go from Turkey across the Mediterranean to reach Israel or Gaza.
Right.
Now, this is important because the last time the Turks tried something like this, a few years ago, they sent a freighter loaded with humanitarian aid. It was blocked by the Israelis, and the Israelis actually boarded the vessel, and 3 Turkish citizens were killed in the scuffle that ensued. That was a disaster.
Right.
And the Turks were enraged, but they restrained themselves. This time, I think Mr. Erdogan is sending that flotilla certainly to help the situation in Gaza. There's no doubt about that. Not so much to challenge the Israelis, because I think he knows what they will do. They will probably intervene to try and block its arrival. That could lead to far worse circumstances than the ones we experienced the last time. I think he's waiting to see what we, the United States, will do.
Yeah.
He's saying, look, are you going to become part of this train wreck? Are you going to allow a regional war to break out over this?
Right.
Or will you, America, intervene and stop this? Because we have the power to do that.
We do. And the responsibility.
You simply tell Mr. Netanyahu that we're withdrawing the fleet.
Right.
We're pulling our forces at sea out. We will not send in any more support under any circumstances until he ceases and desists from what he's doing. I don't think we'll do that.
Yeah.
Because I think today, Mr. Netanyahu has far more influence and control over what happens in Washington than President Biden. And we have a Congress that is accustomed to something that's very dangerous. They see war as an event that happens on other people's soil, not on ours.
Right.
In other words, It's bad, it's unfortunate, but it happened over there. Well, this is something that could eventually reach us and do a lot of damage here in the United States. So I think Congress has abdicated its responsibility because it's a fugitive from accountability. And again, which goes back to the electorate. The electorate is partially to blame for this because we don't attach much importance to it.
Right.
You know, the electorate is very upset about the fact that we're pushing a Green Deal at the expense of our energy sector, which is in ruins thanks to this administration.
Right.
It should be roaring ahead. We can find a balanced approach that provides some solar power and other forms of green power. But we can't commit suicide the way the Germans did and essentially shut down nuclear power plants and shut down coal plants and so forth. Americans are very attuned to that. They're very attuned to the cost of gasoline and putting food on the table.